Hey, welcome back, everyone. So, of course, now we're on the second day of the Trump trials. Technically, the third if you count the hearings on whether they'd actually hold the trials in the first place. And, of course, as I mentioned, no real new evidence being presented, but it does seem to be the case that Democrats, according to the Trump's lawyers, have pretty much failed to tie Trump to the breach of the Capitol building. Now, as I mentioned, none of this really matters because why? Well, this isn't a normal trial. This is a political trial where the votes are going to happen along party lines, and really the evidence presented doesn't really matter that much. Democrats are going to vote every seat they have, almost without a doubt, 50 votes against Trump, regardless of what the evidence is. And you're going to have maybe 5 or 6 Republicans vote with them because they don't like Trump, regardless of what the evidence is. Very likely this is going to be the case. Now, I'll be explaining where things are at with this. Again, they don't really have the votes. They need 2/3 majority. Unless they pull some strings and try to manipulate it, they can't really do it, to be honest. But I'll be explaining where things are at, what happened today. Also, I want to go into a bit what's happening with tech censorship. Those of you who watched the Disney show, The Mandalorian, that woman, the rebel one with the big gun, that one, she has now been canceled from the show because of a post she made on Instagram. One that, ironically, if you read it, does not reflect how it's being portrayed. I'll be explaining what happened with that, and also some new updates on actually pushback, pretty big pushback against some tech censorship that's happening now. All right, folks. Yeah, good to see you all here. Yeah. Let's see here. Hey, Marlene R., good seeing you. Tracy Williams, yeah, welcome. Good seeing you. Thank you. Bruce Line, thank you, everyone. All right, folks. Yeah. Marie Di Giorgio. Yeah, I like the show The Mandalorian too. I think it's very good. I was really disappointed to see woke culture coming to it. Yeah, quite the tragedy, because it is a pretty good show, actually. All right, let's jump into the first story for the night. And as always, folks, questions, please leave them in the comments. I'll try to get to them. All right, so first off, we're going to go over the first story with the Capitol breach and the trials now taking place because of that. It says here, Democrats have failed to tie Capitol breach to Trump, says defense attorney David Schoen. Now, David Schoen, he's former President Donald Trump's defense attorney, so he's on that side, of course, told reporters on Thursday that the Democrats, while making a movie, have failed to tie the Capitol breach to Trump. He said, "I think they're making a movie. They haven't in any way tied it to Trump." Now, I won't repeat all the evidence again because I've gone over this in several shows now, but basically, they've taken his quotes out of context. While he was giving his speech, people were already breaching the Capitol building. FBI records themselves show there was pre-planning. Twitter actually deleted Trump's posts calling for peace and telling people to go home. And the Democrats, even in the presentation of their evidence, selectively edited out Trump's statements calling for people to peacefully protest. And so the only way they've made their statements is by basically altering the evidence or selectively editing the evidence so the context is not clear. Because in everything they've said, as I've mentioned again and again, everything they've said only stands if you remove the context of the statements. Now, this is aside from the whole issue of, again, whether they have the constitutional ability, right, to impeach Trump, being a private citizen now. The Democrats, again, this is a political trial, not a normal court trial. And so they can do whatever they want. That's just the reality of the way the system was set up for this. If they want to say it's constitutional to, paddle Trump in circles for 5 hours and they vote and they have the majority to do it, they can do it. This is where things are at with this super majority right now. All right, so let's go a bit deeper into this. Schoen continues. He says, "I think it's offensive. Quite frankly, it's antithetical to the healing process to continue to show the tragedy that happened here that Donald Trump has condemned. And I think it tears at the American people, quite frankly." Now, a reporter asked the attorney why they broke from the trial to do a live shot. And he said this. He said, "It's more of the same thing. They're showing the same repetitive videos, making points that don't exist." Now, Representative Jim Jordan told Fox on Wednesday that although the Democrats have highlighted Trump's fight like hell remark numerous times, as I've mentioned on the show as well, they obviated completely another section of Trump's speech where he told the protesters to be peaceful. And I've mentioned as well his quote, fight like hell, right? The actual quote, if you watch the whole clip, right? If you watch the whole clip where he says fight like hell, it's very obvious he's talking about the legal battle. Because at the time, again, you had dueling electors from 7 states. You had multiple lawsuits still going through, including from Trump's team, including from Sidney Powell, including from Lynn Wood. Now, as we mentioned before, people saying that the evidence brought forth was nothing. People saying the evidence brought forth didn't support any, proof that election fraud took place. They're lying to you, or they have no idea what they're talking about, because 2/3 of the cases that have actually been tried have succeeded. And again, we've already seen in several states now, these come out and actually have big impacts. New York, Virginia being 2 of the biggest. And as well as I mentioned, you still have the Supreme Court set to hear many of the major cases very soon. So again, a lot of political theater, a lot of false narratives, a lot of altering of evidence in order to make it seem something happened that didn't. Let's go a bit deeper into this now. Jim Jordan said, quote, peacefully and patriotic. Sorry, this is Trump. Trump is on January 6th. Peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. And Jim Jordan said, the one line from the president's speech that wasn't in the Democrats' video is a line that's the most important. And that's where the president said, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Now, another lawyer representing Trump in the impeachment trial, Bruce Castor, said that House Democrats hadn't presented any new information in the nearly 8-hour session on Wednesday. He said, yesterday, we said we didn't dispute that the breach of the Capitol is a terrible thing, and that mob violence is something that President Trump abhors. But we didn't learn anything today that we already didn't know. It's a matter of fact. I wonder why we sat through 8 hours of videos that are under dispute. Now, I won't go too deep into this. Basically, it's the same thing we've been talking about for the past week. They haven't brought forth any new evidence. Every piece of evidence they brought forth has the holes that I've gone over repeatedly. I won't go too deep into it. Nancy Kurtz, you said fortifying the impeachment trial. Those of you who don't get the joke, Time Magazine talked about how a cabal basically colluded to, well, in their own words, a cabal colluded to fortify the election, to change the results of the election. And this is like the accepted narrative now. We won't go too deep into this, right? All right, folks, let me go over a few more stories, then we'll jump into some questions, because basically the impeachment is playing out exactly how we thought it would play out. It is political theater. It is selectively edited evidence. It is half-truths. It's really stuff that if you look at the actual evidence, does not stand the light of day. And it's a lot of, emotionally driven things meant to agitate people emotionally. And as I mentioned, it doesn't really matter what evidence is presented. The Democrats are going to vote 50 votes no matter what. This is how they operate, right? They march in lockstep. It's all about the political interest. Everything's about the political interest. It does not matter what evidence is brought forth. It's very, very unlikely any of them would break from lockstep on this. And again, you're going to have 5 or 6 Republicans very likely vote with them because they're heavily anti-Trump. They've already signaled they would do this. We'll have to see, right? Pretty much exactly how we've been saying things are going to play out. It's on that exact same track. Again, they need 2/3 majority to actually successfully impeach Trump. Unless they come out and alter the rules somehow, they're not going to get those votes. It does not seem to be the case. All right, folks, let's jump into some other issues, though. I want to talk about some of what's happening with censorship. By the way, the drink tonight is homemade kombucha. I'm back to the old school drink we had, and I made it quite nice today, actually. It's a bit of honey in it. It's wonderful. Yeah. All right, folks. So first story here. This is from page 6. It says Gina Carano fired from The Mandalorian after controversial posts. And I'm sorry I'm laughing, but if you read her posts, we'll go over her posts, and you can discern whether you think her posts are controversial and warrant her being kicked off of The Mandalorian, her job. A very popular show where she does play one of the supporting main characters, I guess you could say. All right, so let's go into this. Actress Gina Carano has been booted off The Mandalorian after she penned a social media post that compared being a Republican to being Jewish in Nazi Germany. The former MMA fighter who played Cara Dune in the hit Disney Plus show was also dumped by United Talent Agency, UTA, Variety reported. It says Gina Carano is not currently employed by Lucasfilm, and there are no plans for her to be in the future, a Lucasfilm spokesperson said in a statement Wednesday, and added, quote, "Nevertheless, her social media posts denigrating people based on their cultural and religious identities are abhorrent and unacceptable." Now, let's actually go over her quote, what she actually posted. And you can decide whether her post is actually denigrating people based on their cultural and religious identities, right? So her actual quote said, "Jews were beaten in the streets, not by Nazi soldiers, but by their neighbors, even by children. Because history is edited, most people today don't realize that to get to the point where Nazi soldiers could easily round up thousands of Jews, the government first made their own neighbors hate them simply for being Jews." And so she's talking about the agitation of the public, people being told to hate Trump supporters in this case, and how the same history is repeating essentially. Now, we've actually seen Democrats, public leaders, and journalists and others calling for the cleansing of Trump supporters. We've seen them now get called out and targeted. We see them getting fired. We see them getting called names. We see them getting called, basically canceled, fired, targeted, doxxed, beaten on the streets, and they're not allowed to fight back or they're participating in hate. How is comparing people who are being labeled and attacked, comparing them to what the Nazis did, which actually, if you go back in history and look at the way it played out, it wasn't overnight that they were putting them in gas chambers. If you go back and look at the history, it's not that different. In fact, if you look at the way that communist groups have always operated, it always played out like this. Socialist groups and Nazis being National Socialists, right? If you go back and look at this under Mao Zedong, the target first was the landlords. Then it was the teachers, then it was the religious believers, then it was anyone deemed a rightist. And then that was being a rightist at that time, actually very similar to how Trump supporters are labeled. Being a rightist was anyone who believed in what they called the four olds: old beliefs, old religion, old traditions, so on. In other words, people who believed in holding the traditions and values of the society that the communist system was trying to wipe out. You saw the same thing under Vladimir Lenin in the Bolshevik Revolution and afterwards, where his targets were the wealthy peasants. They called them the kulaks. Same thing happened in Cambodia, where the target was the intellectuals, to the extent even if you had glasses on, you would be targeted by them. You always see this happening in communist movements. We see the same thing happening in China right now. We see them targeting, for example, religious believers, democracy activists. We see them targeting, for example, anybody who opposes or speaks badly about the regime. Always in these systems, always within socialist systems, you always have them targeting a group of people who are labeled, attacked, and blamed for the problems that people have in the society. It is always the case like this. And yes, the current target in America under this exact same train, the exact same train of thought, is white people and it's Trump supporters. And that's it. It's the exact same thing playing out top to bottom, sometimes even word for word. And this woman was fired for saying this, for pointing this out, which is ironic because basically it's showing exactly what she was warning about, right? Exactly what she was warning about, exactly what she was accusing these people of doing, they just did to her. And you can see the way the media is framing this as well. Now, a bit more on this to, well, unintentionally, but also to show how much further this stuff is going right now. Let's go over a few more stories. This is another story. It says Facebook removes advertisements for a professor's book critiquing, quote, toxic femininity. And it says Facebook recently removed advertisements for a book critiquing a radical form of feminism. So critiquing feminism, radical feminism, not femininity. And claiming the book and Facebook is claiming the book didn't comply with its policies. A message to Guadalupe Gifts, a Catholic gift store, showed that the company rejected the ads for the anti-Mary exposed, rescuing the culture from toxic femininity, while citing a set of rules for what products can be sold or advertised on Facebook. In an email, Facebook told the gift store that listings may not promote the buying, selling, or use of adult products, the College Fix reported. The store, quote, tried to post the book on both those platforms and got the same message, that the book violated community policy, author Carrie Gress told the website, referring to Facebook and Facebook-owned Instagram. Now, Facebook rules state that listings can't promote adult products. Facebook didn't respond to requests for comment. The company also hasn't responded to requests from other outlets on the matter. Now, Breitbart News, Gress said on Breitbart News Saturday, quote, Facebook eventually did get back to the bookseller and said there was a glitch in the algorithm. And if it were an isolated case, I would give it all a second thought. I wouldn't give it at all a second thought, but there seems to be a lot of glitches in the algorithms, suggesting that censorship of this type is actually pretty common, with it affecting a lot more Catholic products than just mine. Basically, a Catholic book warning about toxic feminism, not even femininity. And yeah, as Lisa mentions in the chat, you said, but you can say toxic masculinity 100 times a day, which is true, but you can't criticize a social movement and the narratives are trying to spread, right? Dialogue and discussion in society is not allowed on that topic because they will censor you. They continue, right? Now, in a blog post on Guadalupe Gifts website, owner Juan Carlos Valerio is cited as saying it's uncertain whether the censorship of the post was intentional. And it says here, though Valerio noted it was strange that Facebook and Instagram blocked Gress's book 3 months after it had already been posted. He didn't think there was enough evidence that the book had been specifically targeted and was going through the proper channels to get it reinstated. Now, this glitch, quote unquote, listing a book, basically against the far left feminine narrative, radical feminism, right? Not just, there's many waves of feminism. This is targeting the radical waves of feminism, right? What they call the toxic branch of it, which, if you get into it, really does promote a lot of anger and hatred of men, especially. And there's plenty of valid ground to criticize it. And I think discussion on that should be allowed and should be had, right? That was censored. Now, Facebook's use of these adult warnings or things like this is not uncommon as a form of censorship. You all might remember the documentary I did about the election, right? Where Facebook actually censored before they had their fact checkers, right, go over it. And I won't get into how they did it again. We went over that plenty of times, but you might remember they did the same thing to my documentary. Actually, they said that my documentary was sexually suggestive, and they censored the post on it, which was just my face. Right? They censored that using that same exact narrative or a very similar narrative. This is just how they operate. Now, let's go over just a couple more stories on the censorship front, then we'll jump into some questions, because there's a few things happening with censorship right now. This is another one. I'll just briefly say it. YouTube permanently suspended LifeSite News' channel. They also actually completely deleted Terce Livre. You might remember on the show, actually, we had on Brazilian journalist Alan dos Santos. Alan actually texted me just recently saying that pretty much without warning, overnight, his entire product was deleted. And this was a full media business, independent, running on YouTube. They totally deleted him. And again, they've now suspended LifeSite News. And again, they've also censored, demonetized this channel you're watching right now, Crossroads, as well as many other channels of Epoch Times and NTD Television, which is their sister media. And so they're doing this across the board right now, right? Now, also, you might have seen Project Veritas James O'Keefe, founder of Project Veritas, they suspended his Twitter account. So I'll go into this a bit. Epoch Times here. It says, undercover journalism nonprofit Project Veritas says Twitter's reason for suspending its account is false. Twitter suspended the accounts of Veritas and its founder, James O'Keefe, around February 11th after the right-leaning group posted a video of one of its reporters asking Facebook's vice president of integrity, that's like a, sorry, I'm commenting, I guess, but so that sounds like a Ministry of Truth type thing, like Orwell, right? The Ministry of Peace, the Ministry of Truth, and here you have the Vice President of Integrity. So Facebook's Vice President of Integrity, Guy Rosen, for a comment in front of his residence. And it says here, this is the tweet, right? Twitter spokesperson told the Epoch Times in email, the account Project Veritas was permanently suspended for repeated violations of Twitter's private information policy. The account, James O'Keefe III, was temporarily locked for violating her private information policy. The account owner is required to delete the violating tweet to gain access to their account. Now, the spokesperson for Twitter wouldn't provide further information. The Veritas video, though, which is still available on YouTube, shows Rosen, this the integrity guy, right? Shows Rosen being asked by O'Keefe about what Rosen said during the January 7th internal Facebook meeting. Veritas obtained a recording of the meeting showing Rosen as saying the following. He said, quote, in the video, we have a system that is able to freeze commenting on threads in cases where our systems are detecting that there may be a thread that has hate speech or violence. These are all things we built over the past 3 to 4 years as part of our investments into the integrity space, our efforts to protect into the integrity space, our effort to protect the election, to fortify the election, you could even say, right? Now, when asked by O'Keefe what he meant by freezing comments containing hate speech, Rosen turns around, doesn't respond, and walks towards his home. And O'Keefe continues stating, how do you define hate speech? Is it just speech that you hate? Are you freezing your own comments now? And now Twitter claimed the video published private information, which is false, which is the statement from James O'Keefe to the Epoch Times. And O'Keefe continued, Twitter invited Project Veritas to, and we did, appeal that decision with Twitter. An apparent act of retaliation for daring to question their authority, Twitter responded to our appeal by suspending our account, continuing to tell us that Project Veritas could delete the tweet and have their account reinstated. I won't go deeper into this, but what are we seeing here, right? Remember how we just talked about how the woman from the Mandalorian was talking about how hatred was incited against Jews during the, ahead of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, and how the same thing was now happening where people are being labeled, denigrated, justified to be attacked by big media and big government. It's the same thing in some ways. You have people who are being deemed essentially public enemies, and censorship of them, the spread of hatred about them, the incitement of violence against them has been broadly allowed. And that is not considered hate speech on many of these platforms. Many people have pointed, for example, to posts that many people on the left have made inciting and calling for violence against Trump supporters that don't get censored. While on the other side, things like that not only get censored, but people are getting investigated for it and sometimes even arrested now, it seems, for it. There is a double standard with this. And I think this is something that as a society actually is pretty serious, no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, that allowing for censorship of one group of people and based on the same basic standards, not supporting censorship, or in my opinion, I don't think censorship like that should even be allowed, but at the very least not having the same standard held to both sides. You have one side being censored and the other side not censored, based on almost the exact same issues. Just again, it's political interest that is being the line that separates this, right? Now, let me go over one more thing with this, because I think you'll all find this a bit ironic probably, but it's interesting. This is Epoch Times. Google and Facebook are asking the Supreme Court to make suing them more difficult. They're going to the Supreme Court and requesting that they make it even harder for people to sue them. Let's explain this. Google LLC and Facebook Inc. have asked the Supreme Court in an upcoming case to make it more difficult for prospective class action plaintiffs to sue them in court. Now, the friend of the court brief, which also includes eBay Inc., the Computer and Communications Industry Association, the Internet Association, and the Technology Network, was filed in TransUnion LLC versus Ramirez, which is scheduled for oral argument on March 30th. Now, these friends of the court described themselves in the brief as, quote, proven innovators that continue to generate valuable technology through significant investment in research and development. Yeah. I think we saw the discussion at Facebook that James O'Keefe at Project Veritas called about the type of technology they're creating to, help secure the election, right? To fortify the election, I think we could say in this case. They continue that these technologies are especially susceptible to abusive, no-injury class action litigation, similar to the matter before the court. Now, abusive, no-injury class action litigation. In other words, what is this actually, right? Would you consider censorship of free speech, something that is non-injury related? Probably, right? All right, let's go into this a bit more. The company's products, they say, serve large numbers of users, and they continue that those quote large user pools make it financially lucrative for plaintiffs' counsel to identify individuals who allegedly have suffered an atypical injury for what a statute supplies a private right of action and statutory damages. Now, let's just explain briefly what this lawsuit is. Class action suits begin with a lead plaintiff who is serving as a representative of a larger group. In other words, they represent more people, stand in for anywhere from hundreds to thousands of other individuals in circumstances that are similar but not necessarily identical. Now, in 2011, Sergio Ramirez and his wife tried to purchase a car, right, an automobile. The car dealer obtained a credit report on both would-be buyers, but the report from TransUnion, a consumer credit reporting company, indicated that his name matched one on a terrorist watch list maintained by the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the U.S. Department of Treasury. The dealership refused to sell Ramirez the car, so his spouse purchased it by herself. Afterwards, Ramirez asked TransUnion for a copy of his credit report, but it didn't contain an OFAC warning. The agency later sent him a copy of the notice that associated him with two individuals who had different middle initials and dates of birth. In other words, people who weren't him. Didn't appear to be him. The document offered no procedure for challenging incorrect information. Now, we won't go too deep into this, but turned to a class action lawsuit where people feel that they've been affected in similar ways. Now, the court ruled in favor of more than 8,000 class members, finding that each member should receive $984 in statutory damages and $6,350 in punitive damages. Won't go too deep into this, but basically, if this succeeds, you could have a lot of lawsuits like this. And keep in mind, too, that the idea of people being, say, persecuted this way, where they go to the airport and find that they're on a terrorist watch list, isn't really something that necessarily talks about, right? It isn't something that necessarily includes actual terror suspects. For example, after the Capitol breach on January 6th, a lot of Trump supporters noted that they were told that they were on watch lists and so on. Now, could we prove that? No, but a lot of people did claim that. And at the very least, a lot of people did have the FBI show up at their homes and question them. Does that mean then that they have been added to a list somewhere and are suspects somewhere and could be, according to these platforms, have justified by their own rules censorship of these individuals if actions like this are not stopped at the court? Probably. Meaning that if this case is allowed to be stopped, then the way that these companies operate, where they can target people, right? Where they can target people who aren't even legitimately on a watch list for a terror watch list, that they could be targeted and shut down in different ways or denied services because of that. And so, in other words, if this lawsuit is not allowed to go through, and they're not allowed to sue them, and Facebook and Google are allowed to get away with this and basically harden themselves against being sued like this, then this type of behavior could continue. That is, one of the reasons why we have a system of law. It's not meant, and of course, you can argue that there's quite a few holes in it, but at the very least, we can say that it's not meant to just go after people and ruin lives. It's meant to make sure that abuse does not take place. It's meant to be a system to stop this kind of behavior from happening in the first place. All right, folks, let's go over a few questions now, and then we'll go into some more stories for the night. So first off here, this is from Bubba Bong. You said, why is the Epoch Times worth reading when everything they say doesn't matter at all? The MSM, the mainstream media, is the boss, and nothing will ever change that fact, as long as the globalstateagenda.org is allowed to exist. So again, Crossroads is a channel of the Epoch Times. Yeah, it's kind of nice. Let me do these live Q&As. Typically we don't have a ton of bureaucracy, which I quite enjoy. And unlike, I'd say, the mainstream media, which have set narratives, we don't really have that. So I quite enjoy working for Epoch Times. To answer your question, and this is just my assessment, why is the Epoch Times worth reading when everything they say doesn't matter? And you're saying because the mainstream media is the boss and nothing will change the fact. I would say that we're catching up fast, and you actually see a lot of independent media, not just Epoch Times, but Newsmax, OAN, and really platforms like Parler that were coming up very quickly. I think really that having uncensored information, having accurate information, and having institutions that can challenge these other institutions, and more importantly, I think the narratives that they put out there, right? I think it's important to have, because if we did not have alternative voices stating the facts and really exposing what actually took place, because I think that these other companies would be a lot more rampant. And I think it's why they really hate us, to be honest. I'm sure you've all seen the hit pieces they have on us, like, pretty often these days. But the real irony is they don't actually have a whole lot of impact. They write these hit pieces, and it's almost like nobody even notices these days. The influence of the mainstream media is really going down. And, if you don't believe me, go and look at the advertisements on some of their Facebook or Twitter feeds. And you can just watch the insults people hurl at them. I think a lot of people really don't trust the mainstream media at this point. And, it's my opinion that really truth has the natural ability to expose lies. You don't have to intentionally, overemphasize something and try to overemphasize putting someone down on something, because just by stating the truth, you'll naturally show people what the truth is. And by virtue of that, naturally, if they know what the truth is, they will recognize lies when they see them. And, the funny thing is these media and Twitter and Facebook, they tend to hold us, well, not Twitter so much, but Facebook, they tend to hold us to such strict standards on, them going after us if we get like even the slightest error, that we're pretty seamless, to be honest. And I'm not just saying that. We're actually, we have all the layers of fact checking that a lot of these media have gotten rid of, including editors, page editors, copy editors, and so on, to make sure that errors like that don't happen. And so we have all the checks and balances in place that a lot of media have gotten rid of. Just to answer your question, personally, I think that it's important to have alternative voices, especially when you have big institutions that aren't really being honest. All right, let's see. This is from T last name. He said, Josh, will you cover the unemployment numbers? There's the official number, but Jay Powell is saying it's probably 6% higher. It jumped from low to mid to 24 million. Yeah, let me see if we can get something together on the unemployment numbers. Typically, governments tend to use funny tricks to lower the unemployment numbers in general, including in the United States. Let me explain this. Now, The way they often do this, or did it before, and I'll have to look and see how they're doing it now. The way they would do this before is that they wouldn't, if you were unemployed, they would only in the past, during some times, right? They would only count you as unemployed if you were without a job for like, within 6 years. But if you were unemployed longer than like 6 years, you weren't even counted on the numbers, meaning that long-term unemployment wasn't actually being included in a lot of the statistics. And a lot of people were noting, based on that, based on some of the requirements of you having to search for a job while unemployed versus people who've given up the search for a job, that actually unemployment was significantly higher than what these statistics were actually stating. And this has just been, one of those government tricks, I think, to really kind of hide the number of people who are actually unemployed within the system. Because really, if there was an unemployment crisis and it were recognized as such, this would, of course, bring forward a lot more concern about, for example, illegal immigration, which does take a lot of unskilled labor, or jobs you can get without having to have a college degree, where you can actually make decent money as a waiter, working in restaurants, doing construction. I did construction for a while. I loved it. Yeah, I did carpentry for a while, actually, out of high school. Those kinds of jobs pay well. They're hard work, but they pay well. And you can, through that, learn a trade and actually start your own business. And that's not something you need to have a college degree for. Those types of jobs tend to be for people who don't graduate college. They tend, really easy access. They tend to be easier to get into. You can go and learn a trade. You can go to trade school, for example. And these jobs tend to get eaten up by the, illegal immigration policies and so on. And so, yes, there are a lot of people where if they aren't able to navigate the system, if they aren't able to afford college, if they didn't do well in school, it's very hard for them to get jobs. Or people who've been in prison, for example, and have a criminal record, it's very hard for them to get jobs. And really, if that were recognized within the unemployment numbers, right? If the unemployment numbers actually recognized the true state of unemployment, it would very likely be seen as a crisis, and there would need to be reforms on these things. But you can come to your own conclusions on why you think government isn't interested in having those discussions. But maybe it's because doing so would mean they would have to change some of their policies, and they have their own interest in maintaining a lot of these policies. Because what is the nature of a welfare state? A welfare state is a state of dependence. And a state of dependence where your income is dependent on government handouts. In other words, there was an analogy that Soviets made during the Soviet time of the Soviet Union. And personally, I don't think it actually happened. I think it was an analogy. But they said that one day Joseph Stalin was walking around with some people, and he said, someone said, "How do you control a country?" And he says, "Watch." And he reaches down and picks up a chicken and rips out all of the chicken's feathers. And then he puts it back down and hands it, puts forward his hand with a handful of grain. And he says, "Now this chicken will depend on me for the rest of its life." In other words, you remove people's facilities for independence. You remove their facilities to be self-reliant. And then they are dependent on you for handouts and for their survival. This is the way big government policies often work. And really, a lot of their policies do create and support systems like that. Dinesh D'Souza, in his book, The Big Lie, which is actually really good, I do recommend it. He describes policies like this basically as a racket, where essentially what politicians say is, vote for us, and we're going to rob, higher tax, whatever you want to call it, a certain segment of society, and we'll give you a handout from it. We'll give you a kickback of the money we steal from these people. That's essentially what they're saying with these tax policies and with these free handout policies. Vote for us, we're going to take more money from these people, and we're going to give you a cut of it. That's what essentially these big government programs state. This is from Michael Ketter. You're saying, "I subscribe to the Epoch Times to be better informed." Yeah, glad to hear. Thank you. He said, "I don't roll my eyes and say whatever or okay, please, like I do in reading the mainstream media." I'm glad to hear. This is from Joe S. He said, Josh, what are you also talk about the likelihood of China taking over our energy grid? Okay, so as we mentioned previously, Biden did actually roll back Trump's policies that forbade the Chinese Communist Party and other countries from controlling our energy grid. And as I mentioned, there are many ways. I'll get into your question, but just briefly, there are many ways you can conquer a country when you're dealing with unconventional warfare, when you're dealing with what China would call unrestricted warfare, when you're dealing with what the Soviet Union called active measures, or or ideological subversion. Basically controlling the institutions, taking over the institutions, or using the different elements of power within a society to create a domineering force within whatever section that is in. Now, when the Chinese Communist Party does these things, oftentimes the way it works is that they use government subsidies to bid on contracts, for example, with business warfare, below cost. And so businesses aren't able to compete with it. This is one of the issues you have when state-run businesses like the Chinese Communist Party's rail industry is able to basically survive without having to make a profit, and they're competing on the international markets with free enterprise. In other words, businesses that have to survive on profit. This is one of the problems you have when you let totalitarian regimes that can lie about their numbers and what their money's worth and manipulate their currencies. When you allow communist and totalitarian regimes onto the open market, you have issues like this. It's what Lenin would have called state capitalism. It's what a lot of big media are advocating for, even here in the United States. In fact, you've had a lot of mainstream media talking about state capitalism as being China's working model for dealing with the virus. To paint one example of this, when the Chinese Communist Party was pushing into Australia, and what they did in Australia is what they do in a lot of countries, which is they buy up or conquer through dishonest business the GDP products of the country, and through that they then gain control over the means of production, right? Seize the means of production, right? Who controls the means of production? Who controls the factories? Who controls the supply chains? Who controls the natural resources? I'll tell you right now, if China doesn't currently control it, and a lot of countries, they're trying to control it, this is the way they operate. Now, as one example of this, they went into Australia, and the Chinese Communist Party's state-run rail industry was bidding for the rail contracts against Australia's other major rail industries. They were bidding below cost, meaning that there was no way an independent business could compete with it, because had they signed it, they would lose money in order to even operate, meaning that they could not do that without subsidies. The Chinese Communist Party finances these businesses, which is why, and what happened in the end was they got the contract. Two of the other rail industries in Australia went out of business, and the third one was acquired by the Chinese Communist Party, right, by their business. This is why Trump put into place, like him or not, this is why he put into place policies in the United States that put sanctions on or forbade contracts with businesses tied to the Chinese Communist Party, because things like this are allowed to happen. And this is how they operate. They've gotten contracts for subway programs in New York. This happens in America. When former President Barack Obama indicted those 5 Chinese hackers, right? The military hackers with Unit 61398 of the General Staff Department, 3rd Department, the Signals Intelligence Branch of the Chinese military at the time. They've reorganized it since, right? One of the things they stole was technology for wind turbines, and it came out in the charges, which of course they never actually faced trial, but it was in the charges that what the Chinese Communist Party had done is it stole wind turbine technology, used the wind turbine technology to pass it to one of their private businesses, which then bid against government contracts in the United States against the company they had actually stolen the plans from, meaning that they robbed this company. They used the thing they stole from them to challenge that company and take their market, and they did so getting American taxpayer dollars to do this. Now, this is the way the Chinese Communist Party operates. And yes, if you let them control the energy grid, let alone any major industry in the United States, and let alone any critical infrastructure, in other words, a system that is critical to the survival of our country, yes, it's serious. And what happens if they gain control of the energy grid? It means, well, they can shut off your power if they don't like something you do. And the CCP has done this before when they had the conflict with Japan over the East China Sea, over the Senkaku or the Diaoyu Islands, whatever you want to call them, which are technically Japanese territory, right? When that happened, what did they do? They forbade the export of rare earth minerals to Japan, which are necessary for Japan's high-tech industry, because China had a monopoly on it. They will restrict access to products to punish you on the diplomatic level and on the state level. This is exactly what the Chinese Communist Party does. And so Biden getting rid of these Trump policies that did forbid things like this from happening allows for these kinds of practices to be carried out. All right, let's do one more story here. I'm sorry, one more question here, then I'll go into a bit more of the stories. Now, this is from Fishman Pete. He said, why do they vote each morning? And what if they vote not to continue tomorrow? As that seemed to be what they vote on. Dems stop Trump's side by dropping after their perspectives. Please answer. You have to forgive me. I'm not sure what your question's referring to. You said, why do they vote each morning? And what if they vote not to continue tomorrow? Well, I mean, I assume you're saying why does Congress vote maybe on the impeachment, and why are they continuing with this? Well, of course, this is political theater, basically. This is within their political interests, and if they have a supermajority, not voting isn't going to be in their interest. They're going to continue voting. They're going to continue doing what they want to advance their own political interest. And real quick, this is from Lisa Petrona. You said, "Hi, Joshua. What are your thoughts on how we can stop this takeover of our country? Are we going to be okay, or will we fail to communicate? Will we fall to communism/globalism? Love your show in the Epoch Times. Thank you." Yeah, well, real quick on globalism and communism. Actually, one of my Chinese friends who's been in the U.S. for a long time now told me something interesting, which actually I hadn't put together. And she said something interesting. She said, you know how Chinese people regard globalism? She says, having lived under the Chinese Communist Party, when you hear globalism, what you hear is the Communist International. Because the International, under the First International and Second International, the Soviet Union, or the Communist International they had in China, it is the exact same narrative that the globalists use. They just have a different name for it. In communist countries, they call it the International, the Communist International. In the West, they call it globalism. That, in terms of technical details, it's almost no different. And so it's the exact same goal. It's the exact same systems. It's the exact same basic idea of having a domineering political system that is able to be the dictator, essentially, of the society. Only they want to have global control with this. During the 60s and 70s, they called this the World Communist Revolution. It's the same thing. Now, what can you do about this? Now keep in mind, communism isn't real. Now, it does work through institutions. There are, of course, practical forms of communism being implemented within social movements, within political structures, within education systems, and so on. But really, when it comes down to it, communism and socialism are a belief. They're if you go back to the 30s and before that, going back to the 1800s when these ideas were still spreading, communism was regarded as a metaphysical theory. And in other words, it was more like a religion than it was a political theory. It was a belief about the nature of the world and the purpose of life, basically. And it was one based on pure atheism, meaning that there's no power higher than government. And so they believed that it's government's job to create heaven on earth, the utopia. And they believed that the enemy of human progress was the belief in God and the belief in tradition and the belief in things that were slowing the progress of humanity as they saw it. Now, you can argue whatever you want on their narratives, but if you want to see how that progress is represented, Well, technically, if that were true and communism was the end state, the highest form of evolution, and the collapse of a communist system would be like the most advanced society and highly evolved men, we can look to the Soviet Union and former Soviet countries, and technically, maybe that's the communist dream. Is that what everybody wants? I don't know. Late stage communism typically gets by late stage communism, typically they run out of people to rob on the government level, and you have equal misery essentially, and then one domineering government class or oligarchy class. It creates monopoly. It creates this totalitarian system. And that is for people who want these systems. Oftentimes they want these systems because they want to be the oligarchs, and they want to be the tyrants, and they want to be the people at the top. They don't imagine themselves as the ones standing in the bread line, typically. All right, folks, go over a few more stories. Speaking of communists, here's a story again. Epoch Times has it. It says, rioters try breaking into Portland Police Association. And let's go into this. That says here, rioters attempted on Wednesday evening to break into the Portland Police Association, law enforcement officials said. A protest began near North Lombard Street and North Campbell. Around 5:15 p.m., Portland police said on Twitter. Participants then attempted to break down the entry door of the Portland Police Association. Now, Portland police said at the time, quote, "We are monitoring the situation," and they were urging rioters to go away, basically, to disperse. Now, this is what they said. They said, "To those participating in the protest, this direction is being given over loudspeakers. Stay on this sidewalk. Do not try to break into the building or violate any other laws. If you do, you are subject to arrest and or use of force, including less lethal weapons." Now, in an update 2 hours later, Portland police said on Twitter that, quote, "all protesters had left the neighborhood after causing, quote, some vandalism to the building." Now, does the narrative of protesters causing some damage to a building and trying to enter a building, when they don't want them in there, or does it sound familiar? Yes, right. Now, you could argue, of course, it's different than breaking into the Capitol building, but it's trying to break into a government building, essentially. One in this case where you would have firearms, one in this case where you'd have a lot of gear that could pose a serious danger to the community. We saw this happen before with the Chaz or Chop site in Seattle, and the attempts of these same radical groups to build the same thing in Portland. And oftentimes when these people are arrested, they get a slap on the wrist and they're set free. We saw, for example, in Seattle when they had the Chaz and Chop site, and these protesters took over a police department, that you had videos of the protesters, the warlords that took over, handing out rifles, firearms to people in the crowds, people who were joining their movement. It's not clear whether those were rifles taken from the police department, but they were distributing illegal firearms. Now, why was that allowed? Why were those people never thrown in prison? Why were they not accused of insurrection when they literally took over several blocks of a community and then declared themselves as basically separate from the country, and were trying to establish their own country and stating basically insurrection? Why were they able to do that without any consequence? And why is the narrative different for the other side, for Trump supporters? Why is Antifa, BLM able to do that while Trump supporters are called insurrectionists if the police open up the barricades and literally wave them inside the building and they enter the building, right? And do commit some acts of vandalism, of course, as we saw, but really even a lot of the mainstream media have admitted there was minimal damage, right? Same thing, basically, two very different narratives. Now, the Portland Police Bureau did not immediately respond to requests for comment from the Epoch Times, but Oregon's largest city, right, has been rocked by civil unrest and violent acts since the summer of last year. Now, I won't go too deeply into this, but it does appear that these are Antifa-like organizations. It's not quite clear exactly who these individuals were, but it does seem to be the case. It's actually interesting to see now that, as I mentioned that they'll probably do, Antifa and BLM seem to be turning now against Biden. They seem to be turning now against the Democrats. And this tends to be what you see happen with these types of movements. It does tend to be the case that the forces that they use in the early stages of revolution to agitate, to overthrow the system as it is, to commit violence, to, like Hitler's brown shirts or Mussolini's black shirts, or anti-fascisti action of the Soviets acting at that same time, Antifa, did all these exact same things. And what happens after, or Mao Zedong's Red Guard, they did the exact same thing. Typically, once these groups, you're saying, yeah, they are Antifa. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they were Antifa, actually. Once these groups actually take power, once the organizations, right, the political side of these organizations take power, in communist countries, typically the first thing they do is take those violent groups that they used for the revolution and they execute them, or they send them off to the countryside like Mao Zedong did to the Red Guard. The first thing you do is get rid of the systems of instability, the systems that were used to destabilize the system, because typically those are the first people to become unhappy, I guess you could say, with the system that they have unintentionally created. Because typically these are people who aren't very smart, right? Lenin called them useful idiots. These are typically people who legitimately believe in the surface narratives that are used to create totalitarian government. And once they realize that they've created totalitarian government, they tend to be a little unhappy about it. And so typically the system, after taking over, targets those people and eliminates them. Now, we'll have to see what this means for Antifa and BLM, because one difference between now and previous movements like this is that we have very powerful media organizations that have done a lot of work to drum up and protect these organizations. And so more than likely, you're going to see them maybe try to write them off or not talk about them or not acknowledge what's happening, or arrest them and then promptly let them go. We'll have to see how this plays out, but history is just repeating itself. We tend to see this. All right, folks, go over a couple more questions here, then we'll call it a night. It's getting a bit late. This is from Stephen Palmer. He said, could the point of the impeachment trial be to distract the public from something else that is happening? That is possible. Personally, I don't think it's the case, but it is possible. This is purely my opinion that I don't think it's the case. Frankly, politics right now is so wild that it's anything is possible at this point. Politics are so wild right now. Let's put it that way. I've mentioned my own analysis, and take it for what it's worth. This is just my analysis. It does seem to be the case that, again, you do have the Supreme Court scheduled to, in fact, hear the challenges to the election brought forward by Trump, his team, right? Brought forward by Trump's team, by Lin Wood and by Sidney Powell. These cases that they filed before during the time when the challenges to the election were first going through, before anything brought forth before the Electoral College votes could still technically be used to overturn the election. I would say that maybe it's in their interest to hold these trials, to impeach Trump, to make sure that the election cannot be overturned. Personally, I think that is their main objective, because I think they know that the evidence is actually pretty strong, frankly. And I think they're afraid of that. Now, and I think that I would also, as I mentioned, explain why they waited, right? They waited for the House waited to pass the papers, the articles of impeachment to the Senate, for example, why they waited so long when it would bring up the constitutional argument of whether you can actually impeach a former president, a private citizen like Trump is now. Why would they wait for that instead of pushing it through immediately? The only thing I could think of is that, well, maybe they wanted to wait till the Georgia election happened when they could win their supermajority, which they did. Personally, I think this is related to, again, the fact the Supreme Court is going to be hearing these cases, and frankly, I think they're afraid of what might happen with that. That's purely my analysis. Maybe there's something I'm totally missing. It's possible. Real quick, Joel is saying, Andy No Unmasked. Yeah, so of course, Andy No, journalist, has written a book called Unmasked about Antifa. It is a good book. I do recommend it, actually. It's very good. Let's see here. This is from Revolution from my bed. He said, how do we enact a constitutional stand down like the military stand down, only to do forensic financial audits to rout out CCP agents a la Swalwell, right? The Fang Fang and so on. You would need to have a government that has enough power and influence over the institutions to be able to do something like that. It did seem to be the case that the Trump administration was moving forward with policies like that. We saw a lot of stories, for example, of them targeting one by one different institutions in the country where the Chinese Communist Party had been targeting institutions for subversion, like the universities, like think tanks, and so on. We saw a lot of different professors, for example, getting exposed for having taken gifts, quote unquote, from the Chinese Communist Party. And we did see that moving forward very aggressively. Now, keep in mind, Trump's ability to do things like that was limited because the Democrats from the House at the time had a lot of influence and they acted to stop everything he did. The institutions, the big media, did everything they could to stop everything he did. And you also had, as we saw, Justice Department and other departments having individuals who did not support him and who would slow ball or block the different actions he was trying to put through. And so a lot of these things were blocked from the inside. If you wanted to have an actual audit for Chinese subversion and issues like this and Chinese espionage, you would need to have a government that actually has enough control over the institutions to actually have policies like that get carried out. Trump tried to do it, but he had a lot of people against him. All right, folks. Last question for the night. This is from Marilu Pilar. He said, "Is boycotting the answer to cancel culture? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We will all end up blind and toothless. Then what?" Personally, I think it's the only thing that works. I know that boycotting is oftentimes taken as cancel culture, and it kind of is. But boycotting, I think, predates cancel culture. Cancel culture is when, you have someone made a statement, 10 years ago, and based on political reasons, they want to shut down individuals, target them, name them and shame them, get them fired from their jobs, and so on. I think the way these companies are acting right now, though, where they're essentially trying to act like mini governments and they believe they can enforce their own laws on free speech, their own laws and what they deem as acceptable actions of individuals, whether it's peacefully gathering to protest or so on, that they can selectively deny you services for these things. I think that if these companies are allowed to continue to grow and allowed to continue to do business, they're going to become even worse, and their powers to do these things are going to grow. That if people don't stand up and challenge them, that yes, they're able to act with impunity. They're able to move forward and do these things without anything to stop them. Now, normally, you'd be able to go to the courts, and the courts could deem whether what they're doing is ethical or unethical, and they could be sued for actions like this. But the way our system is set up, lawsuits like that are very difficult. With social media, for example, because of Section 230 protections, and because really even the court system in the US has a lot of political type biases and issues at this point. And so that's very hard to do. The only power the average person has, although I think going to the courts is still useful, the only real power the average person has right now is to vote with their dollar. And I do think that boycotting companies that do things like this is perfectly justified. And I do think that it's actually something worth doing. All right. And that's just purely my opinion, of course. All right, folks. And we'll end it here. It's getting a bit late. Now, again, I'll be doing these live Q&As Sunday through Friday, with the one exception of, if, of course, if I'm traveling and can't get to an internet connection or something. I will be on tomorrow night at 10:30 p.m. Eastern time, so please tune in again. And as always, folks, appreciate all of you. Always enjoy these conversations. And please take care of yourselves, of course, and also stay informed and stay free. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. This has been quite the week, not just for our nation, but for the show as well. Now, as I mentioned in a recent episode, we found out the same day as the inauguration that YouTube has completely demonetized us. Now, honestly, it was expected, given the current environment of censorship, but it's also quite the blow to us financially, at least for the time being. It's a difficult time for not just us, but for the nation as a whole. In Washington, 6 in the morning, the sky was still dark. News reports said that the National Guard would be leaving, but even by noon, we still saw them stationed on the streets. And I wondered whether this really will be the new norm for the United States, and whether the nation has reached a stage where every national event going forward will have security like this. Now, it's not just the past few days that have been hard for the country, but the last year especially. We've seen panic around the CCP virus, job losses, an economic nosedive that hit small businesses the hardest. And on top of this, we've seen riots sweep across the country that pitted citizens against the police. We've witnessed a political climate where the people of this country are being held to two different sets of laws. And we saw a difficult election where many serious questions were left unanswered. People are losing faith in the integrity of our systems of justice, in our systems of government, and even in our fellow countrymen. Now, I was reflecting on all this as I walked through Washington. It's been hard for me to watch this country, which I love so much, facing so much turmoil and division. And it's difficult to watch our rights of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and freedom of belief being targeted for attacks. It's hard to watch big businesses and the big corporate media working hand in hand with big government in these attacks. Now, it was while I was thinking about this that a man recognized me on the streets. He greeted me and thanked me for doing the show. I've always enjoyed meeting you all, but it was especially so this time. It reminded me how important independent media is during chaotic times like these. Now, I've always held that truth has the natural power to dispel lies, so it's natural that those who lie have it in their interest to prevent truth from being spoken. It takes courage in times like these to stand up, as it takes a willingness to face criticism and attacks. But I also understand that taking up this mantle during this time is what myself and others are being asked to do, and I'll do everything I can to not let you down, and to do so calmly and with good reason. Now, I'm a big believer in finding opportunities in adversity. When one door closes, another opens, and I have faith that for those who stand with integrity, goodness will always prevail. The Epoch Times has been publishing for over 20 years, despite the Chinese Communist Party's best efforts to shut us down. They've gone after our funding sources, they've hacked our website, they've set our printers on fire, they've threatened our staff, and used every means they could to discredit us. And despite the world's second largest economy bearing down on us, we've never stopped publishing, and we never plan to do so. Now, you may be wondering how we've managed to survive all these years. Put simply, we've managed to survive because of you, because of loyal viewers and readers who support independent media. So thank you, genuinely. We couldn't have done it without you. And with that said, given that YouTube has demonetized us, if you want to support us, please consider donating to us on DonorBox, which you can find linked in the description below. And going forward, I plan to continue presenting an accurate picture of the news, including here in the United States. I also plan to continue my work exposing the subversive programs of the Chinese Communist Party, which I think will only become more serious. And I plan also to help expose the forms that socialism is now taking in this country and around the world, while also helping to keep alive the values and traditions that are now under assault. That said, folks, thank you all for being here, and thank you for your support. And while it's possible we may move to another platform, these current attacks will not stop us from speaking the truth. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.